2001 has been declared the year of the senior citizen. We demand that the government of Canada discourage the Canadian tradition of placing senior citizens on northern ice floes and leaving them to perish.
Remember when the CBC used to love doing those on-the-street videos, asking Americans basic questions and making fun of how dumb Americans are? The CBC loves showing a very present, arrogant attitude many Canadians felt about Americans. It was the late 90s. We were smarter than them and loved laughing at them. As such, we rightfully expected that the two economies would separate, with one being much more productive than the other. Well, they did separate, except not in the direction Canadians had hoped. Today, Canada's GDP per capita is on par with the state of Alabama.
Where are you boys from in the world?
Alabama, sir.
Alabama, the land of Forrest Gump. Let that sink in for a moment. And with newly elected President Donald Trump suggesting 25% tariffs, things are about to get even worse. Popular Twitter account Many Been Rinsed keeps saying Canada today sits in a silent depression. Over the last few decades, since Rick Mercer took to the streets, Canada's productivity ranking has been on a relentless slide. And post-COVID, we haven't just stumbled, we've done a Mark Sanchez butt fumble. Ontario, the engine of Canada's manufacturing economy, saw negative GDP growth for goods in 2023 and is expected to see an even bigger decline in 2024. Canada's household debt relative to disposable income is now nearly double that of the United States. It's clear that Canada has used immigration, debt, and housing appreciation to mask growth, and now it's all coming home to roost. Once a global contender, Canada has gone from being one of the world's top economic performers to trailing behind not only heavyweights like the US, but also Australia, a country with the same natural resources playbook. And here's the gut punch. Back in 1970, we were the sixth most productive economy in the OECD. Today, we're clinging to 18th place like it's the last seat on the bus. Meanwhile, U.S. workers are cranking out 30% more output per hour than their Canadian counterparts. That's a gap worth $22,000 in GDP per person every single year. Think about what $22,000 could do for your paycheck or your local hospital. Instead, we're stuck with stagnating wages, a crumbling public service system, and a standard of living that's more doable than desirable. Even the Bank of Canada has had enough, calling this an economic emergency. And our productivity hasn't just flatlined, it's nosediving. While other nations are doubling down on automation, technology, and innovation to supercharge their growth, Canada's bogged down in a bureaucratic swamp, with unaffordable shelter prices and investment levels so low they barely show up on the global radar. So how did we fall so far? And more importantly, how do we climb back? Let's dive in. Productivity is like the engine of a car. When it's finely tuned, the economy roars forward, creating more jobs, higher wages, and shiny new hospitals. But when it's sputtering, well, you're stuck on the side of the road, wondering if you should have called AAA or, in our case, CAA. Productivity is the measure of how much economic output we squeeze out of every hour worked. It's the magic ingredient that transforms effort into prosperity. In the mid-20th century, Canada got this. We thrived. The post-war era saw a productivity boom as wartime innovations were adapted for civilian use. Automation spread through factories, and the auto pact with the US supercharged our manufacturing sector. Back then, productivity growth alone fueled most of our GDP expansion. But here's the kicker. Somewhere along the way, we hit a wall. By the early 2000s, productivity growth started to slow, weighed down by a cocktail of red tape, low business investment, and underperforming industries. Then came the 2008 financial crisis, which further eroded our momentum. And post-COVID, the numbers are outright ugly. Canada now ranks 38th out of 41 advanced economies for real GDP per capita growth. Yes, you heard that right. Almost dead last. And while real GDP growth might look fine on paper, and liberals like Ryan Turnbull love to pretend everything is fine, those cumulative numbers are hiding the cracks. Adjusted for population growth, Canada's per capita GDP has barely budged since 2019. In fact, it's lower than it was a decade ago. Meanwhile, Australians who have a similar economy are almost 10% more productive. And the US are now 30% ahead, leaving us trailing behind like a rusty old Ford Pinto. If you asked me to sum up Canada's economic problems, I'd tell you it boils down to an obsession with real estate, an economy built around catering to oligopolies, and a government hell-bent on overregulation and deficit spending. Over the past 2 decades, much of Canada's investment has poured into real estate rather than productivity-boosting sectors like technology, manufacturing, or intellectual property. In 2023, investment in residential structures accounted for a whopping 6% of GDP, double the US figure. Here's the problem. While buying and selling homes generates some economic activity, it doesn't increase productivity in the long term. It's a lot of money changing hands without making us collectively better at producing goods or delivering services. Instead of funding tech startups or investing in cutting-edge manufacturing, we're throwing our savings into bidding wars for condos. Anecdotally, I constantly hear stories of high-value Canadians leaving due to housing prices, or young people having to sink all their income into shelter costs. If you're a young person in this country, it's hard to want to do productive things when you can't move forward. You can't start a family if you can't afford a house. And unsurprisingly, Canada's 2022 fertility rate of 1.33 children per woman is lower than most other G7 countries. Canada's economy has another problem. A few major players control much of the action in key sectors like banking, telecom, and retail. We basically have 3 companies who control our grocery stores, 3 telecom companies, 5 banks, and 2 major airlines. Without real competition to push them, these companies have little incentive to innovate or boost productivity. Why spend millions on new technology or streamlined processes when you've already cornered the market? Meanwhile, small businesses, the backbone of the Canadian economy, struggle to scale up due to the dominance of these big players. The result? A stagnant economy where the status quo rules. Now, let's talk about overregulation and federal deficit spending. Canada's mounting debt isn't just a problem. It's a runaway freight train. Combined federal and provincial debt is projected to hit $2.2 trillion in 2024, a staggering jump from the $1.2 trillion figure in 2007. And don't think that the provinces are any better. Ontario's debt per person is over $60,000. How much is all this spending propping up the economy? Well, look at it this way. Since the start of the pandemic, 52% of job growth has been the result of the public sector. Oddly, the government is happy to overspend, yet they seem to want to overregulate the private sector, which is supposed to pay for the public sector. Take Solaris Resources, a $700 million mining company that decided to pack its bags and leave the country entirely. Why? Because the federal government blocked a $130 million investment from Zijin Mining under its updated rules for foreign critical mineral investments. The irony? The deal wasn't even about a Canadian project. Solaris needed the funding for its Ecuador-based Warintza project. Yet Canada's bureaucratic quagmire delayed approvals for months until Solaris finally pulled the plug. CEO Daniel Earle didn't hold back, calling the critical minerals policy counterproductive. By January, Solaris will have severed all ties to Canada, moving its operations and even its management team to Ecuador. Let's also not forget the pension funds that exist in Canada. One of which, the Canadian Pension Fund, owns the controlling stake of the 407, which gouges Canadians over $100 to go from Hamilton to Oshawa, in a city desperate for new highways. Or let's also talk about how Frank Giustra and Pierre Lassonde reminded us that the 8 largest pension funds in Canada now have more invested in China than in Canadian public and private equities. Then there's COVID-19, where Canada's approach to lockdowns took a heavy toll. Prolonged shutdowns didn't just stifle economic activity, they left businesses struggling to recover long after restrictions were lifted. If you think I'm some sort of lunatic anti-vaxxer coming at you with this, think again. I'm taking this critique straight from The Economist. And then we have the most recent news. You'd think with this debt piling growing, Ottawa would tighten the purse strings, but no. Instead, we're all about to get $250 rebate checks and a temporary GST holiday on everything from diapers to beer. Sure, a family might save $100 on holiday spending, but the initiative will cost the government $6.3 billion. It's like throwing pennies into a sinking ship while the water keeps rising. So let's wrap it up. Canada's economy is unraveling, and it's clear that the debt-fueled growth model is no longer just unsustainable. It's outright destructive. With businesses fleeing, red tape choking private enterprise, and housing costs pricing out an entire generation, the foundation of our middle class is crumbling. Food banks are seeing former middle-class families while young Canadians find themselves stuck, unable to afford a home, let alone start a family. When Justin Trudeau first came to power, he promised to champion the middle class and empower the next generation. Instead, we've watched as those promises unraveled into photo ops and performative politics. From cozying up at a Taylor Swift concert while riots rocked Montreal streets to offering band-aid solutions like GST holidays, it's clear that his leadership is all show, no substance. Meanwhile, the U.S. is leaning into economic self-preservation, with the president keen on tariffs and trade protectionism. Justin Trudeau, however, seems poised to remain the kind of leader Donald Trump would relish pushing around. And Jagmeet Singh, he's so preoccupied with clinging to power, like eyeing his pension, that he's unwilling to pull the plug on this sinking ship, leaving Canada stuck in a political Groundhog Day. Here's the harsh truth about today's left-wing leadership. It's filled with well-meaning ideals, but led by opportunists who prey on their base's good intentions. Leaders who claim to champion the people until their own interests come calling, whether it's a cushy pension, a Swift concert, or political survival. And while crony capitalism thrives on both sides of the aisle, at least the right is brazen about it. On the left, it's a subtler, pettier brand of betrayal. Canada needs a reset. Real leadership that prioritizes productivity, innovation, and the middle class over short-term optics and personal gain. Unfortunately, with our current political landscape, that reset feels like a long shot. And as the cracks grow deeper, one thing is painfully clear. Without a drastic course correction, Canada risks sliding further into the abyss. All right, everybody, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please smash that like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. And guys, let me know what you think in the comments section. Whether you love this video or you hated it, I can take the comments. Thanks for watching, everybody.